Go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, let's kick this off. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Data Economics Festival brought to you by the Data Economics Company. If you haven't already, please go online and click Lydian.com/festival. There are actually 20 plus content panels this week where digital data and economics intersect, as well as some fun happy hour events that include a mixology class, a virtual golf clinic, and a live sing-along. I can't wait to join the sing-along myself. I have no idea what the playlist is. Today's session is When Precision Medicine and Data Privacy Collide. I'm your host, Alice Crisci, CEO of MedAnswers, creator of the Fertility Answers app, and I'm a proud data steward myself of 250 million consumer data points. I have an incredible panel with me this morning representing four of the most important aspects of today's discussion: ethics, diversity, security, and ownership. Alice Crisci is lead shaping the future of health and healthcare at the World Economic Forum and is based in San Francisco. Her work focuses developing and testing policies to advance precision medicine approaches in emerging economies, for which she released a suite of materials on genomic data policy frameworks and ethical tensions. We could have a whole day just with you, Alyssa. Welcome. Dr. Brad Wilson, co-founder and CSO of Indigenous AI, is pioneering a new business model to create the world's largest repository of Indigenous and diasporic African clinical and multi-omics data. So happy to have you here this morning. Welcome, Brad.
Pleasure to be here.
And Dr. Anthony Joseph, who is co-founder of Unite Genomics, delivering rapid insights of clinico-genomic data sets through an efficient, scalable engine, but he also doubles and triples as a professor at Berkeley. And he runs the Secure Machine Learning Research Group there, which is developing computer security defenses for ML-based decision systems. He also operates the Deacher Lab Cybersecurity Research Testbed. And yes, I have him on speed dial. Welcome, Anthony. So glad you could join us this morning.
Thank you.
We would not be complete without Dr. Robert Groves, Chief Medical Officer of Banner Aetna, who is responsible for population health management. He's bringing us both the physician and payer perspective of precision medicine this morning and addressing data ownership. Welcome, Dr. Groves.
Thank you so much.
I am really excited for this conversation this morning. I'm going to open with a question for Brad. The promise of precision medicine is to deliver personalized treatment plans based on a person's genetics, but that promise isn't quite possible in today's environment, is it? What is missing?
That's correct. There's a significant piece of the puzzle missing in that the genetic diversity that's contained within populations of African descent is largely missing from the public databases and from the map that we're working off of, the human genome map. There was, for example, there was one small study published that looked at about 3,000 individuals out of Uganda that identified over 3 million previously uncharacterized genetic variants. That's just one example. And if we were to look, I'm certain we'd find plenty more.
Yeah, you mentioned that it's an incomplete map. Could you speak a little further to what the map is that we're currently operating from?
Sure. So actually around 20 years ago now, the Human Genome Project, which was an undertaking by the National Institutes of Health, NIH, to map the human genome, that project concluded approximately 20 years ago. And that map was constructed from a small number of individuals whose genomes were sequenced. However, there was somewhat a lack of a diversity in terms of the populations that those individuals came from. So those individuals stood as the foundation for the map that we use today. And unfortunately, that map is missing a large amount of genetic variation that's can be observed in human populations. And what that means is that when you're looking for associations with diseases and other conditions, that if you're working from a map that doesn't include these variants, then you may not be finding the true answers with regards to the genetic drivers of some of these diseases.
And that's true for ethnic diversity and also gender diversity.
Absolutely.
Dr. Groves, what's the impact at the health system level if we only have treatments that are designed for one segment of the population?
You know, I think anytime we're missing data for a large chunk of populations that we serve, we're at a disadvantage, and it perpetuates the disadvantage, because that's not a new disadvantage, as we're all aware. So, this is an area where we need to make up ground, and we need to make it up quickly if we're going to be effective in our strategies that are genetic based. I mean, precision medicine is based on the supposition that if we have clear genetic data, then we can understand exactly what drugs may be most effective in what populations, et cetera. Pharmacogenomics is probably as advanced as any of the genetic fields right now. But if we're missing data on significant segments of the population, it's just common sense that we aren't going to be as effective in treating that population.
That's right. And certainly to the opposite extreme, we won't know who's at risk of receiving the wrong medication.
Fair enough. Yeah, exactly.
Now, Alyssa, moving to kind of a global perspective, the World Economic Forum aims to ensure precision medicine develops in a way that is equitable and beneficial to all. How do you enable precision medicine in areas of the world who have had so many natural resources taken and used without their permission?
That's a great question. And for some context, what we're seeing is an acceleration in the collection of genomic information from populations that have been historically excluded or understudied. And these populations tend to be those that live in low and middle income countries or emerging economies where genomic data policy is not robust enough to kind of guide how that activity is taking place, which creates the risk that outside governments, institutions, businesses can come in and kind of extract that information and use it for their own purposes. The risk in this is not only will those populations that again have historically been excluded will not have more insights relevant to their own better health, but that governments will take a retaliatory action and kind of block further genomic research. And it sounds extreme, but we've seen examples of this. The Havasupai tribe in the United States, for example, back in 2002, was participating in research. Other researchers took the information that was collected, used it outside of the consent process, and really embarrassed the tribe with additional publicized findings. And since then, the Navajo Nation, which is the second largest indigenous population in the United States, has blocked activity from scientists coming in and doing genomic research. So this is a real issue. And one of the things we're trying to do is support multi-stakeholder collaboration to develop policies related to particularly consent and privacy, data access, and benefit sharing to create a safer environment where everybody can benefit from equitable access to genomic research.
And there's so many historical examples of what creates some distrust. And Anthony, I'd love to hear your perspective on how data security plays into that distrust or lack thereof, especially when we almost read every single day another data breach, either at a health system or a major company like Facebook that houses all kinds of data. How can we accomplish data security that could foster data privacy?
Yeah, in particular, data security is really challenging when we're dealing with genetic data because you can't change your genetic makeup. And so if someone is able to get access to your genetic data, they can learn information about you that could be used for various negative purposes. At the same time, when we look at, I work with patients who deal with rare diseases, and oftentimes these are acute diseases, fatal diseases. And so their trade-off is that, yes, they're willing to give up the privacy of their data in exchange for trying to learn something more about their disease. And hopefully that leads to treatments or cures. But it's always this tension. When you're dealing with someone with a chronic disease, I think it's very different in terms of sharing your data, because once your data has been shared, it's hard to unshare that data. But again, I think you have to balance sort of the benefits that are gained societally in terms of being able to develop treatments and cures versus an individual's privacy for their genetic data.
Mm. And Brad, Indigenous, as you kind of previously reported to us, views this genetic data as a natural resource.
Absolutely. It's probably the most valuable. of all the natural resources contained within the continent, as the genetic diversity is so rich, as I mentioned.
And how do you then, as a company, or how do all companies then encourage and foster that kind of collaboration that Anthony spoke to in rare diseases? You know, how do consumers get to partake in the upside or the benefit if they're not necessarily contributing to something as specific as their individual rare disease progress?
Sure. Well, one of the key factors in the area of rare diseases is that often, and the fact that they run in families, is that sample sizes or numbers of individuals in a given study aren't necessarily required to be as large. Since the disease is rare, if you can find a collection of people, a small collection of people that share that disease and look at their genetics, you can often gain a lot of information, as well as the fact that those individuals tend to cluster in families. So the relatedness between individuals is also a very powerful tool in understanding the cause of those rare diseases.
Got it. And when you look at business models like yours and other companies, and we're seeing this crossroads of companies who have been utilizing people's data for profit without permission, how do we feel about that?
It's an unfortunate event, and that people are exploited in that way, and it just contributes to the distrust, unfortunately, and for companies that are looking to actually do good and empower and benefit those populations, it makes it more difficult for them.
And Dr. Groves, we kind of talked about in our preparation is the black market for kidney sales, right? And the oversight and what needed to take place to prevent that from happening, and to prevent exploiting people, underprivileged people, from being motivated to sell their kidneys. How do you see the correlations between that and kind of what we're seeing in big data environments?
That's a loaded question. I think that there are obviously huge holes in the current system, and that when there are huge holes like that, people, let's call them less than altruistic motives, start to rear their ugly heads. And so it's imperative that we actually address the problem of data security first. With regards to the black market for kidneys, some of the same issues apply there. One of the things, Alice, to me, there's a fundamental problem with the way we even think about healthcare data. And I think that in a more perfect world, that data would be owned exclusively by the patient. And that data could be shared by the patient with whomever they choose, but there would be a reward for that. I think of it kind of like banking, right? I mean, my $5 in the local bank doesn't do much, but if I pool it with everybody else's $5, it does a lot. But guess what? I get a little interest for investing my $5 in that bank. So there ought to be data banks, if you will, but the ownership, the first time I heard about blockchain, the first thing that occurred to me was that is an ideal methodology for healthcare data. Now, I didn't understand as much about it then as I do now. There's some clear problems with that in terms of resource utilization, et cetera. But that ability to lock down data so that I own the parts of tissue that come out of my body and the information therein, and I choose with whom I share that. And as a result of that, as a result of investing, if you will, in those data banks, I get a share of that income back. And that is an egalitarian way to do this. Whether you are ethnic or not, it's the same share, if you will, and it's the same bank. All you're doing is pooling yours together with others, if you choose, and you're rewarded for that in some way. And that's a complex system to set up, I realize, but philosophically, I think that's where we need to get to prevent a lot of what are data wars. I mean, there are people fighting over who owns my data, and that doesn't seem like the way we ought to be doing this fundamentally.
Well, that's right. They're fighting over your data and you're not part of the fight. Right?
Exactly.
Definitely seems mind-boggling. What's the world economic perspective on that? The forum's perspective, Alyssa, about how to create the data economies in a way that is equitable for all.
My pipe dream, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so it's a really interesting area and set of questions. It's something I've started to look into with my colleagues, just this idea of benefit sharing. How do you take the benefits of research and share them equitably and fairly with those who've contributed to research in some way? And there are models that exist, but nothing that has to do with human genomic information at this time. And it's a very nuanced conversation. So if we take it up a level from consumer compensation to just benefit sharing, there are a ton of questions around what constitutes a benefit, when should that benefit be shared, with whom should that benefit be shared. So it's not necessarily an individual, it might be at the community level, it might be at another level within a country, and what form should that benefit take. So we're talking a little bit more about money, but traditionally benefit sharing isn't always money. It's anything that kind of that population deems is appropriate in agreement with the researchers they're participating with. So it might be, we need some infrastructure, or can members of our population be lead scientists in this research? Can the population who participates have results shared back with them? And these questions also come into play when it's, research for just information's sake, or research for the potential for a monetized product. And that also changes the equation. So we're still kind of trying to figure this out, but coming up with additional models that can be tested is a really important element of this.
And Brad, how is Indigenous handling the conversation?
Well, I was going to say that, Robert, your dream is close to reality, because that's exactly what Indigenous is doing. We're utilizing blockchain as a tool for security of the data, and a means by which to compensate individuals who make a deposit into our data bank, as you will. That's actually an analogy that I've used myself in describing what we're doing. And every time that individual's data is accessed in terms of to answer a question that's posed by someone, a customer in industry, whether it be pharma or research institute or academic institution, every time that individual's data is accessed through our platform, that individual is compensated in the form of cryptocurrency. And that's our approach to this. And we think it's one that will be revolutionary. And it's 180 degrees away from what we see in terms of what other companies are doing or have done, and what other companies are gearing up to do.
Brad, you're making my day. I love that. And so now we know it's possible. And so there's nothing in the way of actually giving people rights to their own data.
Absolutely. The data should be owned by the individual, as you said, and the power does truly live in when it's collectively leveraged to glean the insights from that population with that shared genetics.
And Brad, for Unite, your benefit is a little bit more altruistic or tied to the disease itself, given the severity of some of these diseases that you're doing your projects on and kind of doing your research. Do you see a different kind of response rate because of that? Because the benefit is really tied into someone contributing to finding their own cure for their disease, or the at least treatment modalities to improve quality of life.
Yeah, so I mean, with Unite, we're very focused on diseases where they're quite acute. And so the timelines for patients are very short. And they're very focused on not just the discovery of new drugs, but also gaining access to existing drugs that might be in clinical trial and they're trying to get early access to those drugs or participate in those clinical trials. But also, once these drugs are approved, they're not inexpensive. They are typically anywhere from $600,000 to $800,000 per year, or for some of the gene therapy cures, they can be as much as over $2 million for a single treatment. And so being able to demonstrate to payers that there is an economic benefit to providing the patient with those drugs is something that they're very interested in. And so it's a challenge of collecting real world evidence and then being able to provide that to the payers.
Wow, that's amazing. Dr. Groves, how does a payer feel about that when someone comes to you and says, well, we have a new drug and we need you to pay $2 million per patient?
Yeah, you know, it's not just the payers, because I think what most people don't realize is that, particularly on the commercial side, now you can talk about Medicare and Medicaid, obviously we're all paying for that, right? But on the commercial side, it's often not the payer's money. The money belongs to the self-insured or the larger companies. Now, there's a huge portion of fully insured, and the difference between the two is in the fully insured population, the insurance company, whether it's Aetna or Cigna or Humana, is taking the risk. When it's self-insured, that means that the company is taking the risk. And so, you know, it's a tough one, because that number, 800,000, that's a huge hit, particularly to a small company that's self-insured. That's a big number for them. There's no doubt that these drugs have brought tremendous benefit. I mean, we're talking about even curing some diseases that previously we hadn't even considered that word. So it's going to be a tough equation to work out. And the other question or the other thought that I have about that, you know, we were talking earlier about banking, if you will, with information. There are drug companies and there are insurance companies, frankly, that by increasing their premium, and drug companies by increasing their prices, are going to make lots and lots of money off of these drugs. My bias is that that should be distributed to those owners of the data. Not all of it, but a percentage of it should be set aside to reward those who have contributed their data to that. Now, you know, you can do it. I think of it exactly like banking. Yes, I might contribute to a nonprofit and not expect anything in return, but I also might contribute to a startup and say, yeah, I'll share my data with this startup or this drug company that's developing a new drug for this particular disease, but I want a return on my investment. And when you're talking about the numbers we're talking about here, we don't have to be unfair to redistribute wealth. What we have to do is be fair to redistribute wealth. And that would go a long way towards solving a number of problems that we're seeing internationally. So I believe that those sorts of things are going to be the things that force us to make a decision of some kind with regards to healthcare. It's broken, it's fragmented, and it is way too expensive. Nobody is even close to spending as much of a percentage of their GDP, gross domestic product, on healthcare as we are. We don't have the outcomes to show for it, so it's not significantly better, although, you know, we're optimized for a different purpose. We're optimized for rescue medicine. We do great at rescue medicine, but we've left behind a whole category, which is that prevention piece of it. So these are the kinds of drugs that will force us to make some really tough decisions about the direction of healthcare in this country. And there are lots of them. They're often called specialty drugs now. And there's a whole industry, which always makes me worry, growing up around specialty drugs. So it's something that we've got to get a handle on and figure out, because there will be more, and we want patients to have them. And the question is, how do we afford that? And how do we distribute that wealth that is made from those breakthroughs?
I'm now regretting not inviting a drug company to the conversation, because certainly in this part of our dialogue this morning, they stand to gain the most from these breakthroughs. because the pricing is not negotiated by Medicare, and because of our current economic model for healthcare in this country, you know, and not having them have a seat at this table is probably a detriment to the overarching conversation. But I would like to kind of hear from everyone, you know, what is your view on that in terms of that value chain, and how do you see the drug companies pushing back on allowing the benefit to be shared with the participants who are helping to develop those medications?
Well, of course they'll push back. I mean, we're talking about money. Of course they'll push back. But I think it is, we ought to think of it as, I go back again, it's banking, right? My $5, just because it happens to sit in your bank doesn't mean it's yours. And it shouldn't mean that it's yours. And my $5 ought to get, right now the interest rates aren't great. I don't know how that market shakes out long term, but there ought to be at least a way to share in some of that wealth. I'm not suggesting that we eat in to profit margin significantly necessarily, but there ought to be some reward for participation. And I think if we do that and we do it well, we'll have better protection of personal information because the individual will have some control over that. I think we'll have better distribution of funds from the profits that are made on those drugs. I think it'll be more equitable. And finally, I think we'll get increased participation. Folks are far more likely to contribute data to a cause if they're investing it instead of just giving it up for free.
Anthony, you and your company know a lot about the cost of drug development, and that recruitment piece that Dr. Gross brought up is a significant one.
So I think there's
impact on recruitment numbers and the cost of drug development.
Yeah, so I think there's a big difference between common diseases and rare diseases. In common diseases, you want very large populations so you can get good statistical predictive power, and their recruitment can be a challenge because I need a very, very large population to participate. With rare diseases, we're only looking for a few individuals, and those individuals are typically very highly motivated. So it might be, so a rare disease in the US is a disease with fewer than 400,000 people. And so oftentimes I'm interested in a subpopulation of that rare disease with a particular set of mutations. And so in that case, the folks are really very strongly motivated by the fact that they want some treatment for their disease. But again, in the case of the common diseases, I think economic models that motivate people to participate are going to be very valuable. The second part to address the cost challenge, bringing a drug to market is well over $1.5 billion in 10 years, and the vast majority of drugs fail. And so I think, one of the challenges that the drug companies have is that they're constantly looking for new targets in the preclinical work. They're constantly trying to get drugs through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. And it's a real winnowing process. So we definitely see the blockbusters that come out at the end of the pipeline. But for every blockbuster, there are dozens and dozens of drugs that they spend hundreds of millions of dollars on and don't make it to market. So I think a challenge for the economic models is how do we sustain both that challenge of getting these drugs through the process, of getting people involved, and ultimately distributing the wealth that's gained from that process.
And coming back to World Economic Forum perspective, Alyssa, when it comes to the ethics involved in compensating or sharing that benefit, are there models that you are already piloting in market and working through the test channels so you can bring data back to the world?
There aren't models that we're currently piloting. We're in the scoping phase of looking at what can be done. But there is this interesting ethical tension that I think has come up in the conversation around receiving benefits versus altruistic donation. And we've seen, certainly in the rare disease community, there's very much an emphasis on altruistic donation because the populations are so small and members have been through these diagnostic odysseys that they don't want other people to have to go through. So contributing their data is done much more openly than with other communities. But on the opposite side of that kind of altruistic donation is a number of questions around, are we, and to what degree should we start to infringe upon this social norm of kind of being paid for our data? Will that slow, and this is the opposite of what Dr. Grove said, but will that slow the progression of research as people are maybe waiting to see how much money they'll get for their data? Are we going to value people differently based on, how unique their genomics are viewed at the time, or the focus of research at the time? So there are these really interesting ethical issues at play that need to be considered and balanced.
I think that is a perfect segue into Brad. How is Indigenous looking at this in terms of pricing and fair compensation and creating a scalable business model where the price to compensate someone for participation is part of your cost of goods sold?
Sure, that's a great question. And really the power of this data, the genetic data, is really achieved when it's coupled with clinical data, right? In order to be able to make the connections between genetic variants and a clinical phenotype is the key. So with regards to that, the compensation to the individual is, it falls along those lines with regards to, are you providing what clinical, are you providing clinical data? What types of clinical data you're providing? So I think it's going to be a scale with regards to, and it's going to kind of be, it's going to be dependent upon the types and amount of clinical data that come along with the genetic data. And then that kind of speaks to how much power that person's data has, and then, how it can be leveraged into some findings and insights. But it's because it's so new, it's something that we've been, we've been developing and talking about, but it's going to be definitely directly related to the amount and, variety and types of data that come along. For a more, for a patient that has, a relatively larger amount of medical challenges, where they have a larger amount of data available to provide, then their compensation should be, it should reflect that. It should reflect, the data and the scale and scope of the data that they're providing. So it's still a work in progress, but it should be some type of correlation between the data and the compensation.
We've seen this struggle in reproductive medicine when it comes to egg donation, sperm donation, surrogacy services. I've been working in a field for 14 years in which we're heavily self-regulated and also in part heavily regulated. And the criticisms of the field is that it's not regulated enough. There are countries and that make it illegal to donate eggs, make it illegal even for research. And that is in part what has led to quite a bit of medical tourism in the field of accessing infertility services. So I'm curious the perspective on regulation. Who should be regulating? We don't seem to have anyone regulating currently. Is there a regulatory body that needs to emerge to provide proper ethical guidelines? The World Economic Forum does it at the global scale, but a data association akin to American Society of Reproductive Medicine, but should there be a government entity that is part of this, a CLIA for data, if you will? What's the perspective on that from everyone? I would love to hear, whoever wants to go first.
I'll be happy to chime in and at least partially address that. We seem to be in a time when we are polarized to either on or off. It's all or nothing. And regulation is bad to one side, regulation is good, though they can't say it, to another side. And the fact is that some degree of regulation can be helpful. I like to take the middle ground. I think the answers are often in the middle. They're not at the extremes. And so I do believe that some degree of regulation can help, if nothing else, align incentives. I think the biggest problem that we have in healthcare, frankly, not just in reproductive medicine, is that we tend to do things the way we've always done them. So there's some momentum and some resistance to change just based on that momentum, familiarity, et cetera. But the other problem is our incentives are not serving us anymore. And realigning those incentives, and that will require, I think, government policy in order to do that. I think one of the reasons that we're not further along with some of the things we know work, for example, there are some things that we know we can do and that work and that have worked in pockets for years. And we don't do them on a national level because the incentives aren't properly aligned. I don't think there's a bad guy here. So yes, I think that policy matters. And yes, I think that a modicum of regulation can be positive. Now, ultimately, regulation tends to regulate itself and end up with a kludge, and sometimes you got to clean that up. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't go down that road. It's a matter of getting it right, and that's not easy, but it's conceivable. It's possible.
Mm.
I'll add to that. I think they're kind of 2 points. One, from a global ethical perspective, there are just different ethical philosophies and tenets that different countries, different populations observe. So I think it would be very difficult to try to set kind of one overarching set of ethical rules that everybody follows without marginalizing or not doing justice to the beliefs of different populations. But I do think we're seeing many groups come up with standards that they recommend being tried out, they recommend being customized at the local level and developed further through multi-stakeholder collaboration that should really include patients and not just your policymakers or your business leaders. The other thing I think is important at this time as we're kind of feeling our way through all of the issues that are coming up is the role of agile governance and having more piloted approaches, more sandboxed approaches where we can test different methods and see what's effective and what's just, and move forward with those. Also understanding that this field is still early, and I think the more we learn about the power within genomic data, the more we'll need to continuously adjust as we move forward.
Anthony, Brad, how does corporate set privacy policy? How do you self-govern?
Sure, I'll go ahead and jump in.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Anthony. I agree with Robert in that there is going to be some level of regulation that's needed, and to also agree with ELISSA that if the regulation is focused on protecting the participant, if it's founded in that, I think people will be more receptive. Because looking at some of these populations, some of these countries that have been exploited in so many other ways for so long, that if those regulations are rooted in protection of those populations with regards to some type of levels of protection from their exploitation in this area, which Anthony also mentioned earlier, is different because this data doesn't change generally. So this is essentially, who you are. This is your molecular identity on a digital level, just in some regards. So there have to be some additional, levels of protection and additional thought put into those regulations. And like I said, if they're rooted and founded in the protection of individuals and those populations, I think there will be greater receptivity to them, and of course seeing it that they are careful not to overstep, which is easier said than done.
Anthony?
Sure. So, the challenge is that as a scientist, if I'm running a clinical trial, I want to remove as many confounding factors as I can. So any variables or factors that might affect the outcome of my trial independent of the disease and the therapeutic. But historically, what that led to was clinical trials filled with white males.
Mm.
And it took congressional intervention with the FDA to mandate that you have diverse populations in a clinical trial. So you have this kind of tension between, what would be easiest from science and what regulation has to provide in order to ensure that the population that actually will be receiving the drug represents the population with which you tested it. We saw this happen with the coronavirus vaccines, where some of them struggled to recruit diverse populations. And now they're expanding the population again in the clinical trial setting to try and reflect the populations that they want to eventually inoculate. So that's on I think that's on the sort of regulation side. From the data privacy standpoint, a challenge when you're dealing with rare diseases is that, if you have a neurodegenerative disease and you have 3 siblings with a particular genetic mutation, well, you know that those are 3 sisters in Idaho, just because the community is very small and you know that they're the ones that have that mutation. So even if you've tried to blind the data or anything else, as soon as you see those mutations in the population, in the subpopulation, it's those individuals. And so I think, again, people in those communities are much more willing to share their data. They recognize that their data can't be kept private. However, I will say that a big challenge when we look at the common disease populations is you often discover an effect called misparentage, which is that someone's parent is not who they think is their parent. And this happens typically when you're doing population scale kinds of analyses, like they did, for example, in Pennsylvania with the health system. And so I think there, the challenge becomes, how do you balance the privacy of the individuals? There's ethical questions. Do you notify an individual that there was a misparentage that has occurred? What happens if diseases are involved? Genetic diseases, do you notify in that case that there is a misparentage that has occurred? And how do you deal with all of the fallout that could potentially happen from that? And so that's a case where there are significant benefits from participating. There are significant benefits from population scale research, but there are a whole host of bioethical questions that get raised.
That's a great point that comes up all the time in the field I work in as well, in particular with donor conception. And when the 23andMe's and Ancestries arrived to market, the idea of donor privacy really went out the window. It no longer exists. And so how do we even kind of take that same kind of, perspective that you just brought up when you do this and there are misparentage cases? Oh my gosh, that happens in my field all the time, in particular because, 30, 40 years ago, donor insemination was kept very private. And you never talked about it in the family. You never talked about it in society. And we're trying to at least cut through some of that in today's environment to normalize the conversation in family building. But is privacy even possible? Not everybody at once. I know that was a weighted question. Is privacy even possible?
I mean, I think the challenge is it isn't, right? Unlike other typical clinical measurements where, it's easy to aggregate and blind a population, it's very challenging to blind your genetic information. If I see you in one data set for a particular rare disease, and I also see you a patient in another data set for a different common disease, I can connect those 2 data sets and know that is a particular patient. And so typically what happens with a lot of these data sets from a research standpoint is everybody knows they can be de-identified, but you're instructed, and when you as a researcher gain access to the data set, you contractually agree that you won't try to re-identify the patients in that data set.
Dr. Groves, I feel like something's brewing in there.
You know, this is a really difficult challenge. And so not only do we need to have policy around data privacy, but when that data is impossible to shield, as in some of the circumstances described, then we need policy around how it can be used. I mean, particularly in the US, where we still don't have universal coverage, and our ability to retain insurance has been in question, you know, sometimes at the Supreme Court level. It's really important that we have some policy around how it can be used. I mean, we all remember the days not so long ago when being diagnosed with something, for example, hepatitis C, I mean, you couldn't get individual insurance. It was not possible. And if you didn't happen to be at the right company that was providing coverage, then you're just out of luck. And that's very costly to society for a variety of reasons. And so, you know, for that reason, it's critically important. Obviously, I think there's a general consensus now that the United States needs to get to universal coverage. Now, careful there. I'm not saying that single payer necessarily, but universal coverage. Everybody ought to have a reasonable option to get insurance. And once we get to that point, I think there will be less concern around those identifications, but it doesn't go away. I mean, this is, in many cases, and this stuff you're talking about earlier, very private information. And so there are some sticky ethical issues that have to be addressed, but ignoring them won't make them go away.
Sure. And one of our participants is asking a great question with what Dr. Joseph, with what Anthony said about the possibility of re-identification from data sets. What is keeping companies that aren't in the academic research IRB area from re-identifying, especially when they are in the business of selling that data? For the example of diagnostic companies selling data to pharma, or from the pharma companies / data buyers from re-identifying. So, you know, should there be legal or regulatory barriers to that, or any path of recourse for patients who find out that their data was re-identified and or used, you know, kind of without their permission? Not kind of.
So there is actually regulation that covers a lot of this. There are, but it's a very patchwork quilt. So the privacy laws and the data ownership laws that exist in different states vary pretty dramatically. And when biospecimens are collected, if you ultimately want to use it in any kind of research or regulatory filing situation, you have to have informed consent of the donor. And so an example of where this unfortunately went quite awry is in the collection of infant heel blood. So when a baby is born, they take a small sample of blood, and it's used for diagnostic purposes to identify rare genetic diseases that can be treated, but otherwise would be fatal. In a number of states, they've realized that the consent forms that they gave to the parents did not cover broad enough research use, and they were forced to destroy the samples. Oftentimes, these samples otherwise were going into research programs and were used to analyze, you know, do population genetic kind of studies. So a lot of these, even the consumer-facing diagnostic companies, when they collect your sample, there'll be a small little checkbox that I understand and I give my consent for my sample to be used for research purposes. When you check that box, what you're saying is that then they can take that data, aggregate it, and provide it to pharma companies, which might use it in a regulatory filing.
When was the last time any of you read the fine print when you go to click the checkbox that says I agree to that consent? When was the last time, if ever?
I refuse to answer that question.
It does seem, you know, when you go through an actual informed consent process, you usually have a human sitting in front of you saying, you know, here are the highlights that you have to read through, you know, with their clipboard in a one-on-one setting. But when it's so much of it is digital electronic and the box says, I agree to the privacy policy, I agree to the terms and conditions, and I have no idea what mine says with 23andMe.
Yeah, I think a challenge here is even in the in-person setting. So in the case, for example, of the infant blood collection cases, you're expectant parents, you're at the hospital, you're doing admission paperwork, and there's just a stack of papers. You have to sign them before they'll admit you. And so is that really informed consent was part of the challenge in one of the states? Or, do you need to sort of say, stop, do you understand what we're going to use this blood for? Is that okay?
And follow-up question from that same participant with the infant blood case. Does the child or infant, this comes up in donor conception conversations as well, get any say when they are an adult to pull their data back? Is that a clearly documented process even?
No, once the data would go into these banks, there in that case, those cases, there isn't a way of pulling it back. And I think this also gets to a very interesting challenge with genetic privacy, which is that it's not just your sample that you really should care about. It's your parents' sample, it's your sibling sample, it's your children's sample, because all of those contain a portion of your sample. And so once it's out there, so if you have a cousin who submits a sample to one of these ancestry sites, you're now in that site, basically, if enough of your relatives are there. And there's no way for you to pull your data from that site.
Sure, we actually see hesitation in creating PGD probes used in IVF with genetic testing to rule out things like BRCA mutations of the embryos, so that people can end that genetic disease. And you need a parent and child to be able to create the probe. And there is a lot of hesitation in the older population who needs to participate in that for that exact reason. There's hesitation. How do we counteract that? How does education accomplish trust? How has Unite engendered trust? How has Banner Aetna even engendered trust with your members? Because it might not be genetic data that is necessarily but in their EHR, but it is a massive amount of data.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem, and it's worse in populations that need it most, frankly, and for good reason. If we look at how indigenous and African American and Hispanic and even Asian populations have been treated historically by what has been medicine, and primarily led by guys like me, right? White, middle-aged guys. There's reason that there's no trust there. And that trust has not been built back, and we haven't done it any favors during the pandemic, frankly. And so the first issue is you got to tell the truth and trust that the population you're talking to will make the right decision. Trying to influence public behavior by lying is not a great strategy, because ultimately that comes out. And we saw that during the pandemic. I'm not going to point fingers in any specific direction, but we all know we saw it, an attempt to not tell the whole truth or tell a partial truth. And I think that's fundamental. That's number one. I mean, if we're not telling the truth, then they shouldn't trust us, right? And so that's the first part. I think the second part is, what are your actions? What are your behaviors? Are they consistent with what you promised, right? This is basic stuff. You tell the truth and you follow through on what you promised. And we try to do that. And when I say try, what do you mean you try? Well, everything is always more complicated than we'd like it to be. And we can't always follow through on all of our promises, sometimes because of issues that are beyond our control. For example, if we commit to, if you give us this data, we'll have this up and running and, by the end of this year, and then there's a pandemic. Okay, well, there have to be allowances for those sorts of issues, but gosh, the first thing is we've to reestablish trust. There is not a lot of trust in in the healthcare system. And there's not a lot of trust in science right now. To get that back, we have to start by telling the truth.
Definitely, I can agree with Dr. Groves there. And in telling the truth, a part of that comes along with that is transparency in terms of what you're doing, what your intentions are, what you're utilizing the data for. Understanding that I'm sure, as Anthony can attest to, that there's no such thing as internet security in terms of there's a person that writes the code to create the security feature, and then there's another person that can write some to figure out how to get around it. And it's an ongoing battle every day. And I'm not quite sure who's winning at the moment, but in terms of the nature of information and its security and the nature of the data and its significance, a combination of those two actually demand a level of truth and transparency, and that can begin to rebuild the trust. But as I have to agree with Dr. Groves in that, and your actions then provide the demonstration, of your integrity in terms of what you're doing, and those two things can help to begin the process.
And the other thing, Brad, that I think is important, and we talked earlier, Alice, you pointed out that most of us don't read our consents in detail, particularly online, right? You click right through it and hit that check box, and because you're ready to move on. And I think we also have an obligation, if we're going to be transparent and if we're going to tell the truth, and let's hope we're going to do both, to translate. And I mean that quite literally, from legalese to plain English. Put a caveat there, if you like, that there are nuances here that aren't captured in the language or whatever. But basically, what am I agreeing to? If we can't get there, then asking somebody to read one of those documents online and hope that they will have any recall as to what was said is fantasy. So we ought to be able to put everything that we offer in as plain language as possible. And that's part of transparency, in my view.
Alyssa, is that part of your frameworks that the World Economic Forum is creating?
So I was going to build on what Brad was discussing earlier, and saying one element that hasn't been brought up around trust is just governance, the system. So I was in a workshop where, of course, the idea of trust to foster genomic data sharing was raised, and how do we build trust? And one of the participants who does a lot of work in the ethics space across the African continent, she said, trust is nuclear. There's so much mistrust from the history of what's happened across the continent. We can't just start with trust. When parties don't have a basis for trust, the structure, the system, creating trust in that, good governance frameworks for responsibility, reliability, accountability, are really critical. And I would just add to that, inclusion is really critical. Again, oftentimes the populations that are the subjects of research are not part of these conversations, and they really need to be, and their viewpoint needs to be recommended and included. So unless there's, again, strong, trustworthy systems built around parties and the inclusion of people who are participating in the research, you're not going to have the foundations for trust or transparency to come in.
Thank you for sharing that. Very, very important viewpoint. Does anyone in the audience have any other questions for us before we start to wind things down? We could go probably a whole day on all these different factions of the conversation. All right, I see one more question coming in. Can we design a system that's inclusive without being exploitative by using their valuable data for profit? I mean, this is what you're doing at Indigenous, Brad. Yes.
I'll say absolutely. If we, follow some of the recommendations of the panel here today, and being truthful, being transparent, sharing in the revenue of of the endeavor. I mean, companies like Indigenous, have to incur, genetics and genomics isn't cheap. It's expensive, and there is an investment being made, but there is just like the pharma companies, they invest big money into the clinical trial, but the return on that investment is substantial, and that they can afford to share some of that with participants in their clinical trials. And similarly, we are following that line of reasoning, and that looking to compensate individuals who invest, make deposits into our data bank, as Robert said earlier, and give them the opportunity to earn investment on their earn a return on their investment, I should say.
I like that. We got sweat equity, we have data equity now.
I would also add that at Unite, one of our core company beliefs is patients over profits. That we really have to start with believing that it's the patients that are really the concern in the room, not the profits. And that's a challenge for a startup. As Brad mentioned, genomics is incredibly expensive, but there is a dire need for a trusted third party that can help bring data together and provide it to researchers.
Well, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for contributing to this conversation. Are there any parting words of wisdom or thoughts before we wrap up?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I also just want to commend each and every one of you for your participation, not just today, but in the world, for what you're up to, for knowing that Banner Aetna has a chief medical officer with your vision. Dr. Groves is incredibly inspiring. To know that companies like Unite and Indigenous are up to such great things in the world, and to know that we have the leadership and wisdom of the World Economic Forum that is helping to solve these challenges across the globe is incredible, and building all those trust bridges, one truly at a time. So thank you all. Thank you to the Data Economics Company for putting on today's event. And remember that if you were just joining us or tagged in a little bit late, you can go to lydian.com/festival. There are more than 20 talks throughout this entire week. Please contribute. Please share your thoughts on what you'd like to hear even next year or throughout the year. There's also a sing-along. There is a mixology class happening and some other fun happy hour events. That's lydian.com/festival. Thanks everybody, and enjoy your Monday.